This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Jamal.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Well, Jamal, we're standing on the verge of war. My opinion is that we're actually at war, and that the war between Russia and now including Belarus, the United States, NATO, and its allies has begun. Vladimir Putin has announced within the last few hours that he's recognizing parts of Ukraine as independent separatist entities, which he needs to step in and now rescue, including the Donbas region, which is currently experienced about 1,500 individual shellings and displacements of large numbers of Ukrainian citizens into Russia who are Russian-speaking. The situation is very grave. It's very tense. Russia also has done nuclear drills. They've extended their war games and with Belarus another number of days. And the pronouncements coming from the Kremlin today and Vladimir Putin, in my humble opinion, sound like the war has begun. We're going to be talking a lot about that. It's a big deal because it has implications for the Middle East, North Africa and the Gulf region. So we'll come at that towards the end. But I think there are two bigger issues from an Arab Talk standpoint. I'd like to announce to our Arab Talk listeners that Nancy Pelosi has announced that the greatest achievement of the 20th century is the apartheid state of Israel. So Nancy Pelosi and her junket of so-called progressive Democrats have sent out numerous statements, and the statement from Pelosi to me seems the most abhorrent and immoral of all of them, calling an apartheid state the greatest achievement in the world of the 20th century. So we'll be talking a little bit about that. And then the ethnic cleansing of Sheikh Jarrah in Palestine continues unabated, with white supremacist Israeli apartheid settlers continuing to attack and trying to ethnically cleanse indigenous Palestinians. So we have a big show today, Jamal.
That's right, Jess. Let's start actually with the Speaker of the House ignoring Israel's human rights abuses. U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi led a delegation of 7 Democrats to visit the country and told, as you said, Israeli lawmakers that Washington's support for Israel remained ironclad, also called Israel's creation the greatest political achievement of the 20th century. That's in a speech at the Israeli Knesset. Now, Jess, it's not unusual. I mean, we've spoken about this many times. It's not unusual for members of the U.S. Congress, both on both sides of the aisle,
right,
to make their annual pilgrimage to the Israeli Knesset and pledge support to Israel. We're used to seeing this, right? But it is, I would say it is inexcusable.
It's a new level, Jamal.
And that Israel now is an apartheid state, as recognized by major human rights organizations and its own former attorney general and many others. So by making this visit, the way I look at it, and the way I'm sure you see it the same way, by making this visit shortly after the release of Amnesty International's report, Pelosi and her entourage have endorsed apartheid. And they have normalized apartheid.
Absolutely. And that's the thing that I find so morally reprehensible and incomprehensible, because you're exactly right, Jamal. This is not breaking news that members of Congress and the Senate, Republican and Democrat, despite their wide differences, would go and have a love fest with the leaders of the apartheid state of Israel and speak to the Knesset. But as you and I have talked about, the timing of this is really even beyond the pale for American, politicians. And there are a couple of things which, are especially, painful and difficult and immoral. You put your finger on one of them, the timing. The international community has, roundly condemned Israel as practicing, as if not acting, if not being an apartheid state. This is Amnesty, this is Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, former Israeli, attorney generals. I mean, this is, they're widely condemned as an apartheid state. So, but it's occurring at a time, Jamal, when the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians is raging out of control. And it's also occurring at a time, and, we began with this at the top of the hour, with impending war between NATO, the United States, and Russia, and now Belarus.
I have to ask you a question. Is this the most urgent trip that Nancy Pelosi, the third most powerful person in the United States,
if not the world,
to take members of Congress and to go to Israel to pledge allegiance and to say that this is, the greatest achievement of the 20th century, when we have, like I said, we were going to talk about that, what's going on in Ukraine and other places. At the same time, Amnesty International releases a major report less than 5 miles away, by the way, from the Israeli Knesset. This is where Sheikh Jarrah, and we're going to talk about this, and Palestinian homes are being demolished in Jerusalem. They've been taken over by Israeli settlers less than 5 miles away. She didn't bother to going there. The Attorney General, you mentioned the Attorney General, Michael Ben Yair, said, this is his own words, "My country has sunk to such political and moral depths that it is now an apartheid regime. It is time." He's pleading with the international community here, Jess. It is time for the international community to recognize this reality as well. So who do you pay attention to? I don't understand Nancy Pelosi. She's not listening. I mean, she herself is a politician. She's I'm sure she reads Israeli
she knows
media.
this stuff. I'm sure she knows
this.
She
has aides who brief her on things like this.
But here's the calculation.
She didn't bother to read Amnesty International. She didn't bother to read this plea by the former Attorney General of Israel.
She did. And that's what makes her trip. And Barbara Lee and Ro Khanna and Eric Swalwell and the other so-called progressive Democrats so immoral at this point. Their political calculation is this, Jamal. All the polling suggests that the Democrats are going to get slammed, smeared, and slaughtered, politically in the upcoming midterm elections. Most likely, not only will they lose the House, but they will most likely, it looks like, conceivably could lose the Senate. Nancy Pelosi has decided to hitch her wagon to an apartheid state to save her political you-know-what. And her calculation is to kind of forestall the carnage, political carnage that's going to happen in the midterm elections. She's got to bend over and kiss the political behinds of the apartheid regime of Israel so as to bring in whatever kind of support she can get from AIPAC and the other support, pro-Israel support that she's going to get here in the United States. It's a wrong calculation. I mean, notwithstanding the morality, which I think it's a deeply immoral calculation.
It is immoral. I mean, there is no question about.
But I think it's a wrong
issue.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, and to hear Ro Khanna say that he's a progressive. Here's what Ro Khanna says: "I'm a progressive for Israel." Does that make any sense? That's like saying I'm a progressive.
I'm a progressive for apartheid.
I'm a progressive. I'm a progressive for slavery. I'm a progressive for racism. I'm a progressive for Jim Crow politics.
All that I have to say, it is really sad, shameful and sad.
But Jamal, I think it's also an incorrect calculation because the Republican Party is really split, in a lot of different ways. They're going through their own fractions, and fractionated kind of politics having to do with Trump, not Trump, in the midterms. But to see Nancy Pelosi support an apartheid state, what this is going to do is split the Democratic Party in such a way and the voting in such a way that it will guarantee the Republicans a win in the House, for sure. I have no doubt about that, actually. But also will set the stage for Democrats to also lose the Senate. I think she's making a horrible calculation. She has miscalculated. And how... So,
and she's tone deaf. And she's tone deaf.
She is tone deaf. And my question to you is, what is the progressive and even the mildly, not even, let's say, a progressive element of the Democratic Party, but what about just people who believe in justice? How are they gonna kind of, wrap their minds around Nancy Pelosi saying the greatest political achievement of the 20th century? Not the fall of apartheid South Africa, not the Nobel Prize winners in science, not all of the amazing things that have happened with the defeat of Nazi Germany in the 20th century, all of these great political achievements and the birth of all these democratic regimes. No, that's nothing. An apartheid state, in Nancy Pelosi's mind, is the greatest achievement politically of the 20th century. Goes beyond the pale. And this, Jamal, I'm afraid, is going to come back to haunt her and the Democratic Party.
It will. Which brings me to our next topic, just of Sheikh Jarrah.
Yeah.
As you know, we've spoke about Sheikh Jarrah. Sheikh Jarrah has emerged now as a symbol of Palestinian resistance against Israeli control of East Jerusalem. The plans to evict Palestinians living in Sheikh Jarrah last year, which started earlier than this, by the way, in order to replace them with Israeli colonial settlers, pretty much was one of the reasons that sparked the Israeli assault on the Gaza Strip in May, if you recall.
Right.
And now we're seeing the settlers backed by a Kahanist, which Israeli media has been describing as the Israeli KKK. Nancy Pelosi won't tell you that. This is a member of the Israeli Knesset, Itamar Ben-Gvir. He set up shop in Sheikh Jarrah. They're back at it. To date, 5 Palestinian families have been evicted, and another 20 families comprising of about 300 people face eviction, pending the Supreme Court rulings that was postponed because of the unrest that happened a few months ago. Right. So now, with the distraction of what's going on between Russia and the Ukraine and so forth, they're back at it. Nancy Pelosi was schmoozing in the Israeli Knesset. She didn't bother to go to this Palestinian neighborhood. She did the kind of photo up with Mahmoud Abbas, who is in Ramallah, who himself cannot go to Sheikh Jarrah, right?
Right.
Just to see we have a balanced policy. We've met with the Israeli Knesset. Let's now meet with Palestinians. But she didn't bother to talk to the ones who are suffering under the brutal occupation and under the brutal apartheid regime. And so now we're back at this precarious position, Jess, that Israel is basically starting the ball rolling to evict Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah, and it could happen any day. And
here's my prediction, Jamal. It will happen when the Russians invade. That's how this is all interconnected. This is the classic Israeli ploy. Get cover from the United States, have a large international event happening where the world is paying attention, and use that as cover to ethnically cleanse Palestinians. And I'm afraid that... And I actually think the war has already started. So,
Well, there are also, and that's why we want to talk a little bit further about this, because to clear the dust and explain what's going on from all the misinformation that I've been reading, even right here in the U.S. media, when they cite it, this is part of the whole disputed territory, et cetera. So the argument now that's been made that the Palestinian families, were offered a great deal by the Israeli Supreme Court in November, which is the deal would allow them to stay on as protected tenants for at least 15 years and require them to pay a symbolic rent of about $750 annually to the Nahalot Shimon organization that claims ownership of the land. Those are, this is the great deal. So obviously, historically, some of the land there in Sheikh Jarrah was owned by Jews before 1948, right? So there is no mystery about this. And then Palestinian families moved into parts of Sheikh Jarrah. The rest is owned by Palestinian families. So now the argument is saying, okay, well, like after decades, we're going to evict you because this land has prior owners.
Hello.
Okay.
Hello, Jamal.
And you have all the millions of Palestinians
who are
their
prior
descendants, now their descendants, who owned 90%, 88% of the land or something like that, in that figure before 1948. No one talks about them getting back rental income or going back to their homes. So you know how they apply the law,
Well,
what's yours is mine, and what's mine is mine, and what's yours is mine as well.
Exactly.
This is by the way, I think JFK said that thing. So I'm quoting him. What's mine is mine, and what's yours is mine. They want to claim, they want to evict these poor families who lived there for decades. And they're now like third generation or fourth generation living on the land. But then they don't want to return the land to the millions of Palestinians across the globe who have homes, who have land, who have entire villages.
But that's what's not being spoken about, Jamal. That's the missing piece of the description in the media, is that the racist application of the Israeli Supreme Court interpretation of the law. It's like, if you happen to be Jewish, then the law applies. But if you happen to be Palestinian, Christian, or Muslim, then the law doesn't apply to you. I mean, and you're right. And people need to know this, that prior to the illegal creation of the apartheid state of Israel in 1948, close to 90% of land ownership was by Palestinian citizens, Palestinian inhabitants, indigenous Palestinians in Palestine. And, those Palestinians, they're in refugee camps. They've been displaced. Maybe they're on their land, but they're trying to be.
Most of the people who live in the Gaza Strip, the 1.8 Palestinians who live in the Gaza Strip, they were all basically made refugees in 1948. They came from Haifa, they came from Asdod, they came from Jaffa, they came from
all over, man.
Bir Sabah, all over. And that's why they live in Gaza. I mean, no one talks about this.
So, this it's all connected, because this is what Nancy Pelosi doesn't want to speak to. This is what the media doesn't want to speak to. And this is why I'm really concerned about Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah and in Gaza and, throughout, all of occupied Palestine now, because I think with the Russian invasion, kind of progressing now, the Israeli military and its apartheid leadership will use this as a pretext for further extension of their land theft and ethnic cleansing. This is a very dangerous time, Jamal, for residents of Sheikh Jarrah. I mean, I just have to go back to what you said before. It's so spot on. Nancy Pelosi, is this really the most important thing in the political agenda right now? You have out of control inflation. You have, a war that's going to destabilize not only the United States and Europe, but perhaps the entire world. You have your own party that's falling apart before your eyes, and you have, divisions within this country that are tearing it apart, and you want to go and celebrate apartheid. So that nothing.
Well, the question, Jess, is this what her constituency is? This is what her constituency elected her for?
I don't know. She believes that. I'm not sure the problem is that she represents people in San Francisco and Southern Marin, just north of the Golden Gate Bridge in Northern California. And that's been her district for 30 plus years. And she gets reelected People attempt to run against her. They're never successful. She has tremendous sway and power and authority. And listen, Jamal, just to be real, she has been pro-apartheid her entire career. This is,
Depressing.
Nancy. She has. She's been a darling of AIPAC. She's been a darling of pro-Israel groups. And this is in so-called progressive San Francisco. Now, you and I have been saying this for many, many, many years, that San Francisco is not as progressive as people make it out to be. And, a lot of recent things have happened in San Francisco, including the recall of 3 board members of the school, the Board of Education in San Francisco. So I don't know how to answer your question, whether or not her constituency in San Francisco and Southern Marin, this is what they elected her for. I think if people knew the details, we knew about her trip to do this to the apartheid state. But did you see it anywhere else, Jamal? Did you see it anywhere else on CNN, on MSNBC?
Well, it was covered, but actually no one talked about the timing.
Right.
Right. They covered it as a protocol news or as routine, that this is, again, yet another delegation of U.S. Congress going to Israel. But no one talks about that this comes at the heel of the damning Amnesty International report, clearly outlining step by step the development of apartheid in Israel since the Nakba, since 1948. And
right.
That's basically what she's trying to ignore and pledge allegiance and
but
show
listen,
support.
we need to confront Ro Khanna and Eric Swalwell and Barbara Lee, and these are they are all self-anointed progressives, Jamal, especially Barbara Lee, my God, who comes from a truly progressive area representing Oakland, Berkeley, and parts of the East Bay. She truly represents a deeply progressive segment of the Bay Area in California. And I think the question that you asked is better addressed to Barbara Lee. Did your constituents send you or elect you to go and to celebrate apartheid? She was one of the major anti-apartheid figures. When she was.
Think about this scenario. Think about the scenario when apartheid was on retreat, let's say, in the 80s. And then in the midst of that, you had the group of progressive U.S. congressmen and congresswomen travel into apartheid South Africa.
Meeting with Afrikaners.
Exactly. What would the optics been like?
Well, and what if they said apartheid South Africa is the greatest political achievement of the 20th century? How would that be received? Would anybody say that apartheid South Africa was the greatest political achievement of any era? I dare say not. But, this is where people and their constituency need to hold them accountable. I mean, the idea that you could say, this is the most unbelievable spin, I'm sorry to bring it up again, but to say progressive for Israel is a non sequitur. It makes no sense. You cannot be progressive and for apartheid. And somehow Ro Khanna gets away with it. Somehow Eric Swalwell gets away with it. And Barbara Lee, for that.
No, they're not going to get away with it. Maybe they think they're going to get away with it, but hopefully intelligent people will see through that. Yeah,
and this needs to be confronted. But again, I don't believe that the timing of this trip was random at all. I believe that the timing, because of the Amnesty report, was timed primarily because of that. But Nancy Pelosi knows about what's happening in the Ukraine right now with Russia, and I think she saw this as, just like the Israelis do, they see it as a great opportunity because the world's attention is somewhere else. They're betting, Jamal, the Nancy Pelosi, I'm going to call them the Nancy Pelosi squad, Ro Khanna, Barbara Lee, and Eric Swalwell, that no one will pay attention because, they're more worried about...
we're paying attention, Jess.
Yeah, and we're going to continue to pay attention because everything is connected. And they will need and have to account for this political calculation. And because I really do believe that the Democrats are going to suffer a horrible defeat in the midterms, I'm going to blame Nancy Pelosi for fragmenting the Democratic Party further, because what's this going to do to Democratic voters who are progressive, Jamal, when they go to the polls in 2022 later this year in November? Are they going to say, "Yay, Nancy Pelosi celebrates apartheid. That makes me want to go out and vote for Democrats again"? It's not going to happen. It just won't.
It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Well, you're listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. So we're going to talk about the impact of a Russia-Ukrainian war or conflict on the Middle East. But let's start just by basically discussing what Putin's message in his speech.
It's war. I mean,
and just to kind of remind our viewers and listeners, I mean, one of the important points, and I'm looking at his speech here, is he talked about what he said. These are his words: "I consider it necessary to take a long overdue decision to immediately recognize the independence and sovereignty of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic." So.
But our listeners and viewers need to know that that's Ukraine.
Yeah,
Donetsk and those two areas are part of Ukraine.
Not according to him.
Well, that's my point. But right now, internationally recognized by the United Nations, by the entire world, they are Ukrainian citizens. And this is just to remind everybody, this is what Putin did with Crimea. He said Crimea is an independent breakaway republic that we recognize, but he militarily went in and took it over. And
first, if you recognize these two republics, and then they are your allies, and they needed weapons to defend themselves or support, you're going to intercede, right?
And that's what he did. But that's what they've done. I mean, the Russian separatists in Donetsk, for example, right now have Russian weapons. They have Russian intelligence. They speak Russian. They use the Russian ruble, by the way. So, on their Russian media, they're telling people to evacuate because they are saying that the Ukrainian army is getting ready to engage in a slaughter of its own citizens. I mean,
I have a question for you regarding this, Jess. I mean, why is this any different than the United States recognizing Israel's control over the Syrian Golan Heights or occupation of the West Bank?
I think that's such a great question, Jamal.
I mean, aside from all the hysteria that I've been watching since he made those statements on U.S. media, I mean, I look at it that actually he intelligently, I would say, and calmly laid out Russian foreign policy, Russian interest. This is what he was, and we'll go to the other points. But then I see the hypocrisy here, and everybody's going crazy. Why is he making these statements? I mean, Russian recognition. Well, the United States recognizes Israel's Israel control over a Syrian territory. I mean, that it was basically, since it was occupied, was asked multiple times to withdraw from by UN resolutions, including the Golan Heights, the West Bank, etc. And so, why is this panic over Russia?
Well, the panic over Russia is because the United States has this kind of belief regarding a strategic interest that confronting Russia right now is in their strategic interest. And that's why they see the asymmetry, and that's why they see it differently. Because, I think you rightly said, Jamal, I listened to Putin's speech. I listened to the English translation of it, and he laid out a very compelling analysis for whether or not you agree with it or not. It was a very compelling analysis of Russian strategic interests. His point of view is that he feels a threat by NATO. I mean, there are weapons, nuclear weapons, that can easily strike, and non-nuclear weapons that can.
I'll help you out here just by a quote from Putin. He said, "If Ukraine was to join NATO, it would serve as a direct threat to the security of Russia." And these are his exact words.
Yeah, and he believes it. And there are other countries that are bordering Russia that, are part of NATO, that he's very concerned about. But here's the thing, Jamal. You asked me this last week. Did I believe Putin would actually invade? And I said, absolutely. And from my perspective, he's already invaded. He has exerted so much psychological pressure in the last week. I mean, almost 200,000 troops, nuclear war games, missile tests. He's sending blood, replacement blood, up to the front line, medical teams. I want to quote what you've said multiple times on this show, Jamal. If it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's kind of like a duck. So if it walks like war and talks like war, I think it's kind of war. I mean, and, maybe his backup plan is maybe he's not going to go all the way to Kyiv, but he's going to take over these breakaway republics and incorporate.
Well, he doesn't have to do it. Actually, I agree with. He when you recognize the sovereignty of these two states, and now you have to provide them with support and recognition and support both militarily and economically. And if they maintain their hold, you've already taken part of the Ukraine. You know what I mean? It's kind of like it becomes a Russian satellite.
That's right. And that, in my mind, is war. And so, just to kind of go back a little bit on this, Jamal, when Putin was doing the same thing with Crimea under Obama, one analysis is Obama let him have it. Obama made the calculation. He wasn't willing to go to war. He wasn't willing to confront Putin or Russia at that time. And so basically Russia took over Crimea without much incident whatsoever. And I think that set the stage for Putin, who has the long view. I mean, here's the thing. Putin is playing chess, and Biden and NATO are playing checkers right now, because Putin's bigger ideas, he's going to knock off these republics. He's going to recognize them as republic. He's going to recognize them as independent entities. He's going to take them over. He's going to continue to eat away at Ukraine. I think he's going to go after Latvia next. And this is part of his long-term plan.
Okay, here's the other thing, just also to buttress when you're talking about how, taking over these territories, and that's where I make a comparison with what Israel has been doing. He, of course, starts talking about the whole history of the Ukraine,
right.
Long thing about the origins of modern Ukraine.
Right.
This is his words. These are his words. Modern Ukraine was entirely created by Russia, more precisely Bolshevik Communist Russia. This process began immediately after the revolution of 1911. Then he continues to say, Ukraine never had a tradition of genuine statehood.
Wow.
This reminds you of Israelis and their supporters saying that, well, Palestine really never was a state before, or something like this.
That's exactly the argument.
Not talking about Palestine being part of greater Syria, part of the greater, different Arab empires and so forth.
Yeah, and that's why I was just going to say, that's why I think NATO and the United States are blowing it. And frankly, in my opinion, it's way too late, because I don't see how they're going to militarily intervene. And here's the other thing. If they start to impose sanctions, Putin will use that as an excuse to really take things over. So he's extremely brilliant, very smart, ruthless, an autocrat. He's doesn't mind using force. And I have a feeling that this is going to be a historical moment, Jamal, that we will look back on many decades from now as a way to redraw the political map of how things are, how work is done, how politics are done in the modern era. He's part of a larger group of thugs, the president of Belarus, Putin, Xi Jinping in China. I mean, these guys, together with their buddies in the Gulf and other areas, are going to rewrite things in terms of how the world is going to be. I think, Jabal, I think we're on the losing end of this, frankly. I think
these are his words, because you've mentioned sanctions. I've had that next, and this is what he said. They are trying to blackmail us again. They are threatening us again with sanctions, which, by the way, I think they will introduce anyway as Russia's sovereignty strengthens and the power of our armed forces grows. And a pretext for another sanctions attack will always be found or fabricated, regardless of the situation in Ukraine. He pretty much has prepared himself. We always say he's a very smart guy. He's must have made his calculations as far as sanctions.
So my question is to you, Jamal. I mean, can anybody stop Putin now?
No. I think I don't see any other exit for
there's no exit.
Zelensky and the Ukraine other than meeting directly with Putin and signing basically an agreement, promising not to introduce NATO, promising not to have strong relations with the United States.
Yeah, I think it's a joke, to be honest. I mean, Zelensky would be smart to do that, but here's the thing.
He'll save his country. He'll save the death of maybe hundreds of thousands of people.
Well, maybe he'll save people's lives, but I think the Ukraine is going to be part of Russia within the next period of time. I mean, again, I'm sorry to keep going back to this, but Obama blew it when he let Putin have Crimea. And there's another thing that Putin said in his speech, Jamal, which I thought you might bring up. He said with the breakup of the Soviet Union.
Oh, that's right.
That people...
Russia paid its debts, and the Ukraine... because Russia had, basically the new Russia had to kind of undertake, even though these republics were part of the Soviet Union, they got to walk away free from carrying over any of the debts.
Exactly. And that's an interesting, his analysis from a Russian perspective. You could see how he's strategically analyzing the historical consequences of that. And he said basically the breakaway countries and republics from the former Soviet Union got away without not only paying their debts, but without being able to decide for themselves what they really wanted to do, basically intimating that they were coerced to leave. Now, that's a particular reading of history, and we know like Belarus and other satellites continue and have stayed very, 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 very close to Vladimir Putin. But I don't want to paint too rosy a picture for Vladimir Putin, but he's got problems. He's got economic problems. He's got, a lot of young Russians, the majority of their equivalent of Gen Z and Gen X, don't like at all what's happening in Russia right now. You have the problem of Dagestan and Chechnya right now, which is a big thorn in Putin's side right now, which is not going to go away very easily.
Well, I was going to talk about this. We don't have too much time because this is where I see the Western double standards when it came to Chechnya. And the Chechens, as you know, they've been fighting for ages to break away, and no one raised a finger to help
Not
them.
one. When they were getting slaughtered, Jamal, and continue to get slaughtered,
And the question is why, and I can answer it because they are Muslims.
Exactly.
I mean, it's very simple. This is the double standard when no one helped the Chechens, no one helped the Dagestanis, no one helped the Sharkas.
Exactly.
And those are the kind of the Muslim republics there. But I want to take us, because we have a limited time, just to the question, how will this also affect the Middle East? Russian invasion of Ukraine definitely will send shockwaves across the globe, especially Europe, and as far west as the United States. Even if nothing happens, even if the United States does not send any troops there, look what's happening to the stock market every day,
and the price of oil,
exactly.
Price of gas.
So, what's going to also happen to the region further south, like the Middle East? I was looking at different things. Especially, here's one thing, Ukraine and Russia account for 23% of the world's wheat exports. This is according to the S&P Global. Okay, so in the Middle East, the Ukraine, by the way, is dubbed as the breadbasket of Europe. But for the Middle East, they also rely on wheat. The Middle East was the Ukraine's third largest buyer in 2020 and 21. This is according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. More than 40% of the country's recent wheat exports went to the Middle East. Egypt, with a population of over 100 million people, is the world's largest importer of wheat.
Wow.
And where do they get their wheat?
Ukraine.
They get it Ukraine and Russia. Libya, Lebanon also are big buyers, along with countries like Yemen and Syria. They depend through the World Food Program procurement on Ukrainian wheat for aid. So even the aid that they receive for the poor countries, that comes from the Ukraine. So it's going to have substantial effect on countries in the Middle East. And then lastly, of course, Israel, which has been trying to kind of walk a tightrope between Russia and the Ukraine. Well, guess what? Yesterday, before Putin's speech, Israel was reaching out to Russia, supposedly to help it if the Russian invasion should happen, that the Russians will cooperate, so it will allow them the ability to open humanitarian corridors to evacuate Israeli citizens by land to neighboring countries. They've already established a diplomatic mission in Lviv in western the Ukraine. So they have many Israeli citizens, several Israeli companies operating. So it's the effect will be, I think, devastating to many Middle Eastern countries.
Well, I think that's exactly right, Jamal, and it will further fragment whatever balance there is among the Middle East, North African, Gulf alliances right now, because just at a time when there was all these economic difficulties going on in the region, guess what happens to the power of all these thugs in the Gulf when the price of oil goes to $100 a barrel? Now these Gulf emirs and thugs who meet with the apartheid leaders, like they did last week or 2 weeks ago in Bahrain, now they're flush with cash. And so when thugs have cash, Jamal, they act with impunity even more. So I just think that there's no good outcome. I mean, I know I'm being kind of a downer right now, but I'm agreeing with this analysis that it's going to create even more turmoil, even more difficulties. It's going to create the kinds of alliances that are going to just enhance thuggery and anti-democratic principles in the Middle East, North Africa, and the Gulf. Not that the Gulf had any kind of semblance of democratic principles to begin with, but this is going to be bad. I mean, there's no way to look at this, and Putin's in the driver's seat. He's 100% in the driver's seat. I don't see, as you said before, I don't see any off-ramp. I don't see how the Emirates or any of the emirs or any of the Gulf countries can do anything about it. I mean, they're kind of loving it right now. When was the last time oil was close to $100 a barrel, Jamal?
Yeah, but it will have other repercussions. Yes, they will benefit the petrodollar countries. They definitely, for a short period of time, they will benefit until the United States, by the way, which we know we've seen this scenario before, forces OPEC and forces them to lower their prices, whether they like it or not. I mean, if they've done that during the war on Iraq, when you put the pressure and say we can, when the American, go to your gas station, now gasoline's over $5, right? And then people are huffing and puffing, even though in Europe it's more than $8 per gallon.
Right.
They sell it there by the liter. So imagine when it jumps to $7, what will happen here?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Jamal. So I know we only have a little bit of time left, but I have to put this out there because I think there's another motive here. One of Putin's best friends is Donald Trump. So if all of this chaos makes it easier for Republicans to win and Biden to lose, and Trump is still the front runner, I think Vladimir Putin is doing a calculation to, weaken Joe Biden and the Democrats even more right now, because he's setting the table for 2 years from now when Donald Trump, if he can or if he will, run again. And he sees the fragmentation and the division in the United States is only good for his long-term vision of what's going to happen to Russia as it moves forward. So I think he's got a very complex chess game going on right now, Jamal.
I agree with you. I mean, well, number one, we have to also, concede the fact that what he's doing for Russia's best interest, regardless
100%.
of Donald Trump, regardless of Europe, any other countries. He has reached a point to say no is no. And I keep thinking about it, talking about NATO and how far NATO has, when he was talking about NATO, moving into Poland and here and there, and before you know it, they're going to be at the borders of Russia. And I'm asking myself, will the United States allow Russian military installations, air base, etc., right in Mexico or right in Canada? I mean, ask yourself.
And how about when they tried it in Cuba? Look at the
exactly.
Cuban,
This is what I mean. You have to look also from his lens about this, how NATO has been expanding north little by little, and now they're inching towards his own borders, and he's not going to accept that. That's number one. The other point is the economy. You've mentioned the economy, and he talks about sanctions. Russia has been suffocating recently, on multi levels, and he wants to negotiate a way out. I believe. I mean, when you are strengthening all the countries around him, when you're isolating Russia economically, I mean, how is it going to look towards the West?
Exactly. So that's why during the Olympics, Jamal, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin had a love fest. And, he has already calculated the sanctions in his analysis, and he's already figured out how he's going to finance, this expansion back into the Ukraine. And he's done these calculations, and he said it in his speech. He understands that the sanctions are coming. And here's the wild card, Jamal. We'll have to end on this. We'll come back to this. You can bet, and I'm not a betting man, but if I were, I would bet that if there are sanctions, you're going to see a kind of cyber attack against NATO countries and the United States. I mean, what we don't realize is that Russian malware is everywhere in the United States. And, you can expect a very significant, very debilitating cyber attack to happen against Ukraine, to happen against NATO countries in Europe, and even here in the United States. So it's going to get pretty bad.
What's your way out?
There's no way out.
I'm sure there's a way out.
No, I mean, if the United States and NATO want to capitulate, and I mean, the only way out is to sell is to sell Ukraine down the river. I mean,
listen, sanctions are not working. Yeah, they hurt Russia, but he doesn't care. He knows.
Care.
He kind of expects and made his calculations vis-a-vis sanctions.
You have to give up on Ukraine. You just have
NATO. He doesn't feel that NATO is a threat in its makeup, as long as it doesn't make it into Ukraine, and he's saying, "You're going to do that. We're going to invade. Basically, I'm ready." I mean, what people are seeing, what military analysts, experts, what they're seeing is that the Russian military is ready to invade any time, and you don't have any.
The only way out, Jamal, give up Ukraine. I'm not saying we should do that. Don't get me wrong, but the only out.
Well, the question is why. I mean, what interest does the United States have in basically starting a war with Russia?
Well, I'll go even further. I think in the back of Zelensky's mind, if he's trying to do a calculation, because the United States has screwed him so many times, the United States has screwed Ukrainians and the Ukraine so many times, he might be having his own calculation. Maybe it's not a bad idea to hitch his wagon with Russia. I'm just saying, I mean, I'm not saying yay or nay, or is it bad?
Well, that's what I started by saying. I said that the solution is really in Zelensky's court. He has to hop on the closest
Putin wagon.
Well, he has to fly to Moscow,
he's going to
say, "What do you need me to do? What do you need me to do to end this crisis?" Because if he's going to gamble on the United States, and we've seen gambling on the United States in Vietnam as a lesson. We've seen gambling on the United States for those who wanted to oppose Saddam Hussein in Iraq and thought the United States could bring peace and prosperity.
What about Afghanistan? What about Africa? I mean, the list.
Look at the writing on the wall.
Libya.
And I think if he does, he might come to his senses and maybe work something. He's still, whether he likes it or not, he will have a closer relationship, both historically, politically, linguistically,
culturally,
religiously, culturally, with Russia than anywhere else in Europe and the West.
That's what I think, but I don't think it's politically correct to say that. But we've never been politically correct, Jamal. But that's what I believe.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download our shows from there, and we will talk to you next week.
See you next week.